Hey team, I'm Ben Dutter. I am the Chief Strategy Officer and founder of FusePoint, a company by Power Digital. I'm excited to chat more today about FusePoint and kind of give you an example of one of our audits that we do for clients right as they're first onboarding with us. At the end of the day, we really want to produce as much value as we can in our engagement. And so the way that we do that up front is go through this entire measurement audit and strategy recommendation before we ever sign with a client. So here's an example. I hope it's helpful and demonstrative of the work that we would do together. So I think it's important for us to just start off with a little bit about FusePoint. Our mission is to power the relentless pursuit of growth. And when we say that, we don't just mean growth for ourselves or growth in terms of revenue for our clients, but also our personal growth in our team, our growth of our learning and our understanding, even helping the lives of our clients' customers is really important to us. That's why we're so selective with the types of brands that we work with, and we want to make sure that those products actually make a positive impact in their customers' lives. And so for us, growth really is all about growth mindset. And the key piece of a growth mindset is humility and curiosity. And so for us, it's really about understanding what does work, what doesn't work. Not every situation has a clear solution. And so it requires science, it requires investigation, it requires grit. And so for us, that's really important to continue to power through and uncover what are the biggest constraints to improving a business or a team or a person. And let's remove those blockers and figure out what does work and double down on that. I think a bit about our typical performance is helpful too. So this is for clients in the last 2024 calendar year period. So FusePoint is a part of a larger marketing agency called Power Digital. And FusePoint, the way we talk about it is Power Digital is FusePoint's largest client. And so we actually have Power Digital data for their clients that do not use FusePoint versus those that do. And those that do use FusePoint grow 22% more in a year than those that don't. So it's important, again, for us to have data and to validate and prove what we can do for our brands. And we're very proud of this stat and monitor it closely on a monthly and quarterly basis. But enough about the brag stuff and get into something more interesting. I think our approach, nothing revolutionary here, but it's helpful to understand how we kind of set the table. And so for us, it's really about this quadrant here on the right, and we want to place any client that we're working with on this quadrant. If you look at it here, there's an axis of growth and there's an axis of efficiency. And there's a common refrain in the industry around, well, you can pick growth or you can pick efficiency. You can't do both. And we find that to not be true. There's plenty of brands that are growing very efficiently. And when we're talking about efficiency, we're really talking about, what does the P&L say? At the end of the day, what's the EBITDA? What's the contribution margin? What are these factors that are, financially prudent for us and outcomes-based business? And growth, we look at it not just in the sense of just total revenue, but also new customer versus repeat. Is LTV extending? And what's kind of the multi-year CAGR, or compound annual growth rate, that we're seeing overall? And that helps us identify, kind of set the table of what is the biggest challenge. If you're a brand that is growing, but you're highly inefficient, as in you're not profitable, we want to dig into the P&L with you and look at, well, what are the customer economics? What are the unit economics? How much are you spending as a percentage of your revenue? That has a very different problem solution set versus those that are maybe really efficient and profitable, but they're not growing. Maybe it's that they're underinvested in marketing. Maybe it's they haven't figured out what's incremental. Maybe it's they're too focused on retention and not enough on acquisition. So they all have slightly different problem solution sets. And our job is to really dig in there and diagnose what is the biggest constraint to growth and how can we unlock that. And so when we talk about marketing, we really talk about it on this time scale, this kind of bell curve. So if you imagine this bell curve being a representation of marketing activity or ad spend, if you will, whatever kind of frame you want to put into that, there's three phases. There's before you go live. Maybe you have some kind of light evergreen campaigns going or some light activity. But before you go live, you want to have a go-to-market strategy. You want to develop a data-driven assessment and analysis of your customer. You want to develop a media plan. There's a forecast involved, et cetera. During is all the things you would normally associate with marketing. You're pushing buttons, you're activating channels, you're producing, optimizations and new iterations of ad creative and all these other things. But then after is sort of more in the big picture side of, did we actually do what we set out to do? How did we perform? Were we incremental? Did we contribute meaningfully to the business outcome? Not just what some leading indicators say, but did we actually drive top and bottom line improvements? And the way that FusePoint works is we let whoever you want do this middle part, right? Whether that is an agency, whether that's an in-house team, a group of freelancers, whatever, it doesn't matter. Our job is really the bookends of this engagement. So we're set out to do kind of this strategic consulting line item here. So we bucket that into 4 categories: general, sort of ad hoc growth consulting, go-to-market strategy, media planning, and customer and persona analysis and development. And then after your marketing campaigns are live and we're in market and we're spending lots of money, we need to make sure that we have the right data intelligence, the right infrastructure. We're measuring for incrementality, and we're using a combination of experimentation, attribution, and marketing mix modeling, and various other marketing science principles to make sure that everything is actually doing what we say it should be doing. And if not, how do we optimize and iterate from there? So our job at FusePoint is the before and the after, the strategy and the data. And the during part is your partner of choice, and that's how we engage with brands. Our process is this 4-step loop. So if you were to partner with us, what we look at is we want to make sure that we have clean, organized, correctly identified data. And for us, that's all revenue and customer data that we can get our hands on, as well as all marketing activity and spend data. And a lot of brands that we work with, they may have gaps in retail data, they may have gaps in Amazon data, they may have gaps with their customer file, whatever the case may be. We can potentially help with some of that, or we'll actually dig in there and help organize, clean up, and model that data appropriately, or recommend a larger data engineering firm if necessary, if it's like a total rebuild of your data warehouse. But once that process is done and organized and clean and we can ingest that data, then we really want to run an initial media mix model. And that preliminary media mix model is really just focused on the advertising side of the equation. We use that term specifically, and it's not a comprehensive marketing mix model. It's just for media, because really in the day one process, we usually find with clients are spending anywhere from 20 to 25% of their media in the wrong place. And in most cases, it's overspent. They're actually spending beyond the point of diminishing returns. So we really want to identify ad spend waste, either from a total allocation perspective or from a distribution of which channel, like what's the media mix. And so we run that initial model based off of your historic data. That then tees us into a marketing strategy. So we are very strong believers that it's not just a math equation. If it was just a math equation, everybody could just run their own analysis using an open source tool. There needs to be some human context and some creativity, and also some feasibility analysis on, the model may spit out, hey, cut this budget by 80% and plus that up over here. That's not always feasible, because there might be constraints in what's even able to be spent there, or there might be constraints in creative production or a new product drop or whatever the case may be. So we actually have a dedicated team of strategic growth advisors and media planners who actually come up with interpreting the model, but layering in some context and some business know-how to make it more practical. And then finally, once we go live and you're executing those media plans, we want to measure that through incrementality testing, which for us generally is done at a geographic test level. We find test and control markets. I'll talk more about that later. But those markets, then we can validate that the media mix model and ongoing, if we were to run a more comprehensive marketing mix model, which factors in things outside of just advertising, then those effects are true. But this generally is a monthly cycle where we make sure that we have the right data, we rerun that model, we adjust our media plan, we validate and test and measure, and that measurement then comes back and gets built back into the intellectual capital. One thing that's important to know with FusePoint, we are not a technology, we're not a SaaS, we are a service provider, and we're big proponents of making it easy for our clients to get the most value out of us possible, which often means that we're actually working in your own data stack as opposed to something that we're doing. We're happy to have you onboard your data onto our cloud, and that's a main way that we work. But for most of our brands that we work with, they want full access to the data and they want to own that data. And we don't have like a proprietary platform or something that we lock you into. So as we get into the analysis here in this initial free consultation, this appraisal that we run, we look at the strategic framework here. We call it the power circuit, but essentially there's these 6 pillars that constitute a business. What's the overarching business strategy? Who's the audience? What's the product? What messages resonate with them? What channels do you distribute in? And how do you measure that? And so for us, generally, when we're talking with brands at FusePoint in this initial audit phase, this kind of day 0 deliverable, we're doing a channel assessment and a measurement assessment. So we're trying to understand, are you allocated in the right places and are you incremental or not? Are you actually driving a business outcome per your specifications or per what your attribution tools are telling you? And so we're focusing on that in the context of this audit. So in this redacted audit, I'm going to walk you through actual brands data of how we would deliver this. So this is a redacted example, but we would customize this and build this out specifically for your business if you decided to move forward with an audit with us. So starting off, big picture problem, this brand over the last 2 years was not growing. You can see the revenue here kind of has a natural seasonal up and down, but they were just continuing to spend more and more in advertising. And so their margins were getting pinched, and obviously their media was not as incremental as they would like it to be. Further, we did an analysis on their CRM and their customer file, and we actually established a lifetime margin as opposed to just lifetime revenue. So we could find, factoring in all of their actual operating expenses, and I'll show you what that scorecard looks like in a second. What is the lifetime value, the true lifetime profit of a customer? And then what was their last 12 months customer acquisition cost, or CAC. So this is just blended all marketing costs into all customers. And so you can see that from a customer economic standpoint, their average customer, they were actually losing money on. Now, the reason why they were not losing money at a high level was because they had some champion customers that are far and above away the average that are dragging it up. But it was getting tighter and tighter and tighter. And so on these new customers that they were cohorting in this last year, they were actually losing money. Other problems that this brand was faced was they had no intentional long-term media strategy. They were just basically ebbing and flowing off of what they saw in platform and what they saw in the P&L. CAC was X today. We got to drop budgets. CAC is Y tomorrow. We got to push budgets. And they were not using any format of incrementality testing. No conversion lift studies, no A/B tests, no geo tests. And so this was part of our findings, was the reason why you're continuing to see this is you're continuing to just dump more and more ad dollars into a problem that is actually arguably a measurement problem and not a ad spend problem. Okay, so the big key questions we wanted to answer with this analysis was, how can we make customers profitable? More recent cohort of customers, as we're acquiring those, they're lower and lower value. What is the actual contribution and value of our ad spend, and how can we reduce waste while growing the incremental return on ad spend, or the IROAS? So we can be budget neutral or even budget negative, but drive a greater contribution, top line, and profit to the business. So we did a deeper dive on the LTV to CAC analysis. So this is that scorecard I mentioned earlier. Let me get my beautiful face here out of the way a little bit. So the panel on the left here is how we calculate LTV. And this is the true lifetime value of a customer, not just the lifetime revenue. So we look at what is your average cohorted revenue for a customer. So not just the sum of all revenue divided by all customers, because that's not accurate, but of customers who were acquired 12 months ago, what was the average value of those customers now as of 12 months later? And so for this brand, it was about $1,100, which is solid. On the surface, you would think, oh, that's a good, that's a great lifetime revenue. We're excited by that number. Many brands are often in the $200 to $300 range or even lower. And so this being over $1,000 was great. It is a higher price point product. It's a luxury fashion, for context. And so their COGS were high. They definitely are bringing in a lot of higher end materials. They're doing some local assembly and manufacturing, and that increases their COGS for sure. They had a pretty big operating team. A lot of this was in creative production. A lot of this was in the marketing discipline of the team, but also just other things around supply chain, logistics, merchants, etc. And so as an operating expense, this is important to factor in to lifetime revenue, because a lot of brands will not look at the lifetime revenue minus operating expense. They'll only look at COGS, and they'll look at lifetime contribution margin. The flaw in that is that while in theory operating expenses are static and a fixed cost, I found that as brands grow, OpEx grows, and the percentage tends to stay pretty static as a share of revenue. That's how often CFOs budget an OpEx line item. They say we need to have a certain percentage of revenue in terms of personnel headcount limit. And everybody always wants more people in their team and more raises and more promotions. So I am not a proponent of the belief that OpEx is a fixed cost. It's actually, I believe, a variable cost. So we want to load that in here. Processing, which is payment, pick, and packs, usually credit card fees, kitting fees, some light things around 3PL, et cetera, and then returns and discounts. And now this brand was really hit hard with a heavy returns and discounts process. Most of that was discounts. It was being driven down significantly. This is gross revenue, by the way. So some brands, they factor discounts out of this number ahead of time. We just want to outlay all the costs. So this combination being at 38%, usually we want to shoot for something closer to 20. So on a typical customer, after all these costs came out of the wash, they were really only getting $40 of margin. Now, this is even before we talk about marketing expense, like advertising, which is over here on the right. So this is how we calculate CAC, the total amount of spend in that last 12 months. This was an estimate. That's why it's in italics, because we didn't actually know what they paid their agency. So we just took a 10% estimate on their advertising spend. Other marketing costs, activations, some trade dollars, some partnerships, referrals, things like that. So we sum that all up, divide that into the total amount of new customers they had, and that gets us to the CAC. So you can see here why this is a problem in the last year. Their new customers were not profitable. Years prior, they were, but as they've been increasing their ad spend and the value of those customers has actually been getting worse from a returns and discounts perspective, it's pinching them in terms of margin. So that's the kind of the crux of the issue from a customer economic standpoint. I'm not going to go into super detail here on all these different levers, but these are the kind of key levers that we see across our clientele of ways that we can actually affect LTV. So things like your pre-marketing profit margin, your AOV, your average order value, the repeat rate, how much of your revenue is coming across in your lifecycle program across email and SMS. What does your community followership look like? What's your UPT, or how many units are you selling per transaction? This was an area of the brand that we didn't highlight, but was definitely below. And then overall, there's 7 tactics that we know that improve customer retention. And so for here, they were missing a few of those. So those were the 2 areas we highlighted. Very weak lifecycle program. They didn't have a lot of repeat purchases from emails. They had a poor kind of open rates. And then they were lacking a couple of things around customer surveys. And the return policy was not super clear on the site. Similarly to the LTV side, we have a CAC drill down here, which again, I won't go through in super detail, but we're looking at the different elements that can affect CAC for a typical business. So things like what's your percentage of revenue allocated towards ad spend, your cost per session, how many of your customers are new versus repeat, what's your organic share of revenue, as in customers coming in direct or through organic search, now with AI as a component of that, conversion rate. And then we know there's 7 levers, which I won't necessarily spoil here, but there's 7 levers that we know across a media program that drive higher incrementality. This brand was only doing 2 of the 7, so that's a big issue, but most brands don't know those. And then seasonality was a weakness here. They really only had 2 big drops. They had a spring and a fall drop, and we feel big proponents in 1 drop per quarter or 1 peak per quarter, where we're having a large release, a large product release, where we get repeat customers excited and there's some newness to entice some new customers, as well as a holiday. So 1 per quarter plus like a Black Friday, and they were only doing 2 really. So that was a big miss on the product strategy and the promotional strategy segment. So again, this is a recap of why the LTV to CAC matters. So then we get into this preliminary MMM. So again, as a reminder, this MMM is really just looking at the incremental contribution from media, so paid media for this example. If we were to partner together, we would do a more comprehensive marketing mix model where we're also looking at things like non-paid contribution from things like PR or lifecycle marketing or SEO. Okay, so for this brand, what you see here on the left and is a chart and a table view, but basically all of the tactics that we measured, and we estimate in a typical month, what are they spending kind of on average per month? What does that spend translate to in the diminishing returns curve model that we estimate in terms of the incremental return on ad spend, so the incremental revenue driven on that ad spend. And we know for this business that they need to be around a 3.5 to be profitable, given their margins. And their whole program is well below that at 169. And we actually highlighted these three channels here: brand search, PMax in Google, and ASC and Meta. I'm not saying that this is always the case for all brands, by the way, but for this brand in particular, those three were particularly negative. So they were not even paying for their own ad spend. They'd have to get at least over $1 IROAS to pay for their own ad spend. So these are actually, they'd be better off just not spending this money at all, and it would save them profit at the end of the day. So we're seeing here on 410K of spend, they're only generating about 693K of incremental revenue overall. And so that assessment estimates that their paid media, which again, my stats nerds out there are going to tell me this is not representative. I get that. This is a quick preliminary MMM where we're really trying to dig in and identify areas of opportunity. But this model is assessing and estimating that only about 28% of the brand's revenue is coming from media. And so you can't just look at a blended MER or ACOS or CAC and say, oh yeah, we're good on a blended level. The incremental level is that there's actually a significant portion, in this case 72% of the business, that is at least not in the short term able to be detected in a media mix model coming from things outside of advertising. So that's an issue where the way they're thinking about it versus the reality is highly different, and that creates a whole lot of profitability challenges. Okay, so then what do we do with that information? How do we optimize that? So in this example, this is a combination of, we've built a custom in-house model. We also use a king of the hill method. So we're running a couple of different models simultaneously on your data, doing an out of sample model check to make sure, out of sample data check to make sure that the model is actually robust and predictive of real data. And at that point, we then make some tweaks and build a scenario plan. The whole point of a model is so that we can build a scenario and a media plan. We're going to change budgets here. We're going to change budgets there. That's going to produce a better outcome for us. And so in this model, there's all that's kind of automatically calculated. But then a human actually who has media planning experience that also has some data science experience is able to come in and make some tweaks and adjustments based on what they think is realistic. So the model coupled with a person recommendations are, you can see here, the spend variance and then the revenue variance. So again, that's the incremental revenue driven from advertising. So we're saying in a budget neutral setting in this brand example, we're going from a 169 on the previous tab to a 169 IROAS to a 215 IROAS here, because we're spending $0 more, but we're putting those dollars in more incremental places, such as we're shifting a lot of money out of Meta ASC and we're shifting more money into YouTube, where even with us accounting for diminishing returns curves, because remember, IROAS is not static, it's going to change. Marginal ROAS is going to change as you push up money up and down. And so even factoring that in with budget neutral, we're seeing a 188K increase in monthly revenue while remaining budget neutral. So a lot of the big key finding there was, a big plus up in YouTube, but you can see some other channels here too, like TikTok was plussed up, non-brand was plussed up, and a lot of that money was taken out of these top three kind of problem children: brand search, PMax, and Meta. Again, not always the recommendation, but in this case for this brand. Here's just a side-by-side comparison of what we would be looking at. So here again, it's a 27% increase in overall IROAS. This is the baseline or the original plan of what a typical month looks like. This is the sort of optimized plan where you're seeing this nice similar spend and revenue contribution where, if it's spending the most, it's also contributing the most revenue. And so you can just kind of see side by side as a media planner what that looks like. Okay, but we're not done there, because we want to make sure that we are using the MMM and its findings to actually inform a testing roadmap, because we are staunch proponents that models only take you so far. They're very useful tools, but they're a way to develop a series of hypotheses. They're a way to create a list of tests that we want to actually run through and for us to be able to validate that model, because the model may have exogenous variables or confounding variables that we are not able to see, or we didn't know, and so we need to validate that. The best way to validate that is through a combination of an intentional media plan that's not just informed by a math equation, but that's also informed through some subjective strategic alignment and then validated through incrementality tests. So what does that look like? Well, for this brand, again, we're zooming back to our strategic framework here. We really want to focus on the audience. We're big believers that all marketing really flows from the audience. Even the product strategy should flow from the audience. Who is your customer, and knowing what they care about, knowing how to reach them, knowing how to communicate with them is the most important element that a marketer can do really to drive value for their business. So for this client, we did a ideal customer profile. So you may have heard of ICP or a persona analysis before. This is that. So we have some tools, we have some third-party research that we can also pull into, and second-party research that we can query panelists and develop this profile. So for them, we wanted to understand how big is the audience, what is the kind of demographic makeup, what are their interests, what are some things that they care about from a brand qualities perspective, and what are some potential things that we can do to optimize conversion funnels and ad copy to actually improve conversion rate for those lower in the funnel, higher intent channels that we saw were struggling, such as PMAX and brand search. And so we saw for this brand in particular, it's very important for them to be innovative. And we also saw a big spike here with influencer picks. So is there a play to be had there where we're talking about, the unique kind of way that they do manufacturing, some of their fabrication, some of the materials that they use? Maybe they showcase inside of their factory, whatever, or go all in on the influencer side. So wanting to layer in some more interesting elements there from the customer side. This is a media brand discovery index chart. So this is looking at what percentage of that audience, so the audience on the previous slide that we identified as being the ideal audience, what percentage of them say they discover brands through these channels? So is it on paid social? Is it through word of mouth? Is it through retail sites, etc.? And the three highlighted ones that we wanted to talk about here is, this audience is definitely lower index on search. They're not discovering brands on search. Maybe they're going to search and they're doing some research there, and maybe that's helping them make their decision, but it's a very low index. Anything below 100 is considered below average. And so this being an index of only 89 tells me that this is a great indication that corroborates what the model is finding, that this brand is probably overinvested in search in terms of the total amount of media dollars there. Similarly, we're seeing a really high spike on celeb and influencer endorsement, which again makes perfect sense with this audience, a luxury fashion brand. A lot of that has to do with self-image. A lot of that has to do with status and status projection. Of course, we want to be affiliated with the cool influencer or the neo kind of Hollywood era, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe there's a play where we actually incorporate heavier investment creatively or media-wise in influencers or in celebrities or some macro influencers, et cetera, some household name brand TikTokers or Instagram reelers, et cetera. Similarly, in that same kind of vein, we see that this audience index is small share, only 17%, but that's a very high index, 2.24, the national average on podcast ads. So is there something to explore? They're not spending any today on podcast ads where they could get actually some net new incrementality out of the program. And so for us, all that informs the combination of the media mix model as well as the media plan and strategic side of the equation from the customer and that analysis. What are we wanting to test in order of priority? What kind of test is that? What is the main KPI that we're going to measure? And what is the impact on the business? I redacted these a bit just to be severe, high, mid, low. But if you were to work with us, potentially we would want to actually quantify that as best as we could, where we think, we think we're going to save you $500,000 in ad spend this year, or we think that we're going to see an increase of 5% in IROAS, and that translates to an extra $250,000 of incremental revenue per quarter, or whatever the case is. So we would want to try to make sure that that is quantified. And if it's a negative thing, it's usually something like this where we're critically overinvested. The risk downside would be we're wrong and we pull budget back in these channels to validate, and we see declining performance in the business or in the test. But if we're right, then it's cost savings. So we weigh those out with you and identify what we think is the most important kind of testing strategy. The nice thing with FusePoint is, since we are a service-led organization and not just a software, is we're able to do a lot of custom designs and a lot of custom tests. So we can work with you and your media team, whoever's placing your media buys, to figure out something like, for example, a stair-step test as opposed to just a classic geo holdout test or multi-cell test, etc. So that allows us to be a little bit more flexible and work around kind of key priorities within your business. Here's just that same list in a Gantt chart view, kind of spread out over a year. And then if we were to work together, this is a recap one-sheeter kind of executive summary of the biggest problems that we're seeing. There's not a lot of growth. Only 28% of the business is coming from media, despite spend being up significantly. The last year, your average customer is not paying for itself. There's some definite big shifts that we can see, and we think that in a typical year, we can have a conservative annual revenue growth while being budget neutral of $1.2 million. So we always want to be ROIing ourselves and always want to holding ourselves to a business outcome that we think is a good business case to take to whoever is watching this, or whoever we do this audit with. Usually is going to be our champion. They may want to work with us, but there's going to be a business case conversation. And so for us here, we're looking at, in this example for this brand, it was $20,000 per month for us to run through all of these scoping, which includes the ongoing media mix modeling, more custom historic data analysis, usually at a customer level, things like an LRFM segmentation analysis. We're going to continuously make the MMM update a minimum of once per month, dedicated analysts, at least one incrementality test per month, and full media plan and go-to-market support, including all of our resources on the Power Digital parent company side of if we have a need to pull in their expertise in a particular question around, say, something like creative or something like setting up a TikTok shop or something like that. So another benefit of working with FusePoint is you get to enjoy some of the advantages of us being a part of a much larger media agency that has expertise tactically in some of those channels. And so this is another nice kind of commercial slide that we could supply to a executive or something of that nature. So hopefully this was helpful for you to see kind of an example of how we would potentially work together, as well as, what the audit typically looks like for working with brands. Every one of these is slightly different because the things that we're finding is going to be different, and where we decide to focus in our time and energy is going to be different. But at a high level, we want to go through your P&L. We want to go through your LTV to CAC. We want to go through your MMM and understand, is there opportunity for us to make a business case internally? And then moving forward, we would continue to make that more and more robust as we work together. So hopefully this was helpful and you enjoyed. I look forward to talking with you more. And if you have any questions or thoughts, reach out to me or anyone at FusePoint. Thanks again. Talk soon.